They came to Dos Palmas for one quiet night by the water. Before sunrise, armed men were inside the resort. Guests were pulled from their rooms, pushed toward the boats, and taken out across the dark sea. By morning, families were calling, police were searching, and nobody knew where the hostages had gone. How did a private island turn into the start of a 376-day nightmare? On May 27, 2001, Dos Palmas was quiet. That was why people came there. The resort sat off Palawan in the Philippines, away from traffic, crowded streets, and the noise of normal life. Guests came for water, small boats, clean rooms, and a night where nothing serious was supposed to happen. Martin and Gracia Burnham were there for their anniversary. It was meant to be a short break. One night near the sea, then back to ordinary life. No warning sign. No reason to think this trip would become part of a hostage crisis. A little before sunrise, armed men arrived by boat. Most people were asleep. There was no clear alarm that gave everyone time to react. The warning came in pieces. Movement outside. Voices. Doors opening. Strangers inside a place where strangers were not supposed to be. Guests were ordered out of their rooms. Workers were pulled into the same fear as the people they had been serving only hours earlier. Some victims were still half awake, trying to understand what was happening while also trying not to make the wrong move. In the first minutes, it could have looked like a robbery. That would have been the easier explanation. Stay quiet, give them what they want, let them leave, and maybe the whole thing ends before morning. But the men did not stop at money. They started moving people toward the boats. That changed everything. The rooms were still behind them. Beds, bags, sandals near doors, lights near the water. All the small things that made the place look normal were still there, but the people were being taken away from them. In front of them was open sea. Once the hostages were pushed onto the boats, Dos Palmas was no longer just the place where the attack happened. It was the place they were disappearing from. By sunrise, 20 people were gone. The people left behind were trying to count names, check empty rooms, speak to witnesses, and understand how fast the boats had vanished into the dark. Nobody had a clean story yet. They had missing guests, missing workers, frightened staff, and families who were about to receive phone calls no family is ready for. Authorities were called, but the first hours were already lost. That is the brutal part of an island kidnapping. If the attackers reach the water before anyone can stop them, the search begins behind the crime, not in front of it. The hostages were carried away from Palawan and toward the southern Philippines, where water routes, jungle terrain, and armed groups made every next step harder. Martin and Gracia were somewhere on those boats with the others. A few hours earlier, they had been a married couple on a quiet anniversary trip. Now they were hostages, moving farther from the resort with every minute. They did not know where they were being taken. They did not know who would negotiate, who would search, or how long their families would have to wait for answers. For Martin and Gracia Burnham, the vacation ended before sunrise. The captivity had just begun. The boats left Dos Palmas while it was still dark. For a while, the hostages could still see pieces of the island behind them. A few lights. The shape of the resort. The place where their rooms, bags, and ordinary plans had been only minutes earlier. Then the water took over. Martin and Gracia Burnham were in that group, along with Guillermo Sabero, another American guest. Filipino tourists and resort workers were there too, thrown into the same fear without warning. Nobody on those boats had a full picture of what was happening. What they did know was enough. A resort was behind them. Armed men were around them. The boats were moving away from Palawan, and nobody was explaining where they were going. On the water, fear does not always look dramatic. People go quiet. They keep their heads down. They listen closely, not because they understand the plan, but because one wrong word can change the mood around a weapon. Back at Dos Palmas, the people left behind had to work from confusion. Rooms were checked. Names were counted. Staff tried to remember who had been taken, who had hidden, who had seen the boats leave, and how much time had already passed. The first reports were messy because the attack had been fast. By the time police and military forces began to understand the size of the kidnapping, the hostages were already farther from Palawan. The kidnappers had gained what they needed most: distance. They knew the water routes better than the people trying to chase them. They did not have to hold the resort or win some long fight there. They only had to keep moving long enough to make a quick rescue almost impossible. For Martin and Gracia, the outside world started to feel far away very quickly. A phone call home was impossible. So was asking where they were being taken, or how long this would last, or what the men wanted from them. Every mile made the normal world smaller. Soon, the name Abu Sayyaf would be attached to the attack. Reporters would repeat it. Officials would talk about ransom, rescue plans, negotiations, and military pressure. None of that reached the hostages on the boats. Captivity began in a simpler, uglier way. A man points. You move. A voice gets sharp. You stop talking. Someone with a weapon looks nervous, and the whole group feels it before anyone says a word. Martin had to watch Gracia and the others while hiding his own fear as much as he could. Gracia had to do the same. Around them were people who had been strangers a few hours earlier, now tied together by the same question they could not ask out loud. Where are they taking us? By the time the boats moved deeper toward the southern islands, Dos Palmas was no longer just the place where the attack happened. It was the last place they had been free. After Dos Palmas, the hostages were not kept in one place long enough to understand the pattern. The men kept moving them. Part of the journey was by boat. Other parts were on foot, through rough ground, small paths, and places where the kidnappers clearly knew more than anyone trying to follow them. Martin and Gracia Burnham had to adjust to that quickly, because nothing around them stayed normal. If they sat down, it did not mean they could rest. If the group stopped, it did not mean they were safe. The first shock from the resort had turned into something slower. Bad sleep. Little food. Wet clothes. No privacy. No clear answer about the next hour. A person can handle fear for a few minutes on adrenaline, but this was different. This was fear becoming part of the day, mixed into every small thing they had to do. Some of the kidnappers were young, which made the situation feel even more wrong. These were not distant figures in a news report. They were right there, close enough to hear breathing, close enough to watch a mood change on someone's face. A nervous guard could be as dangerous as an angry one. A bored man with a weapon could still ruin every second of silence. Martin and Gracia had to learn without asking questions. They watched how the men spoke to each other. They noticed who seemed tense, who wanted to keep moving, who reacted when soldiers were mentioned. None of it gave them control, but it helped them avoid mistakes. In captivity, even a small mistake can become too big too fast. The group was eventually brought toward Basilan. For the kidnappers, that area gave them room. Water routes, jungle paths, villages, hiding places, and people who understood the terrain better than outsiders. For the hostages, Palawan already felt like something from another life. Dos Palmas was no longer the resort they had left that morning. It was the last place where the world still made sense. Then came Lamitan. The kidnappers moved into an area connected with a hospital and a church, and the danger spread around people who had nothing to do with the original attack. Patients, workers, civilians, all of them were suddenly near armed men, hostages, and soldiers trying to respond. From the outside, rescue sounds like the obvious answer. Inside, it is not that clean. If gunfire starts, a hostage does not know who is winning. If someone shouts from another room, you cannot tell whether help is close or whether the kidnappers are about to drag everyone out again. Even hope becomes dangerous, because the moment that looks like rescue can also become the moment everything breaks. Martin and Gracia still had each other, and that mattered. But it was not simple comfort. Martin had to watch Gracia go through every order and every burst of panic. Gracia had to watch and do the same. Being together gave them a reason to keep steady, but it also doubled the fear. Each one had another life to worry about. After Lamaton, the idea of a fast ending was harder to believe. They had been taken from a resort, moved across water, dragged through places they did not know, and brought close to fighting they could not understand from inside. No one around them could promise the next move would be safer. Martin and Gracia could only keep going with the group, listen when orders came, and hope they would still be together when the next stop came. After Lamaton, Martin and Gracia Burnham did not get a clear turning point. There was no moment where someone explained what would happen next, or how long the group would be kept moving. The days started to blur together through jungle paths, wet clothes, tired legs, insects, hunger, and guards who could change the mood of the whole group with one look. Captivity was becoming routine, but not in a way that made it easier. A person can get used to the shape of a day and still suffer through every part of it. Wake up when someone tells you. Move when the group moves. Eat whatever is given. Stay quiet when the men with guns seem tense. Try to sleep even when the ground is hard, the air is heavy, and nobody knows whether soldiers are close. Martin and Gracia had to watch each other weaken. That may have been one of the hardest parts. It is one thing to feel your own body getting tired. It is another thing to see it happening to the person beside you and know you cannot fix it. A husband can want to protect his wife. A wife can want to keep her husband steady. In that jungle, wanting it did not mean they had the power to do it. Outside, families were waiting for news. Calls came. Demands came. Officials spoke. Reporters followed the story because American hostages were involved, and because Dos Palmas had turned into something much larger than the attack on a resort. But none of that changed the ground under the hostages' feet. For them, ransom was not a word in a headline. It was the reason the kidnappers kept talking, waiting, threatening, and moving. Some people were released over time, and every release carried two feelings at once. Relief for the person who got out. Fear for the people left behind. Then came the news no hostage group can forget. Guillermo Sabero, the other American taken from Dos Palmas, did not make it home. After that, hope became harder to hold in the same way. The hostages could still believe they might survive, but nobody could pretend the danger was only a threat anymore. One of them was gone. The line had already been crossed. Martin and Gracia still had to keep going. They had to save strength without knowing what they were saving it for. They had to read the guards without staring too long. They had to stay close when they could, speak carefully when they were allowed, and hold themselves together in front of men who could use fear against them. Weeks turned into months. The anniversary trip was no longer something they could connect to the life they had before. It belonged to another version of them, the version that had packed bags, checked into a resort, and thought the next morning would be ordinary. Now the day ended only when the kidnappers allowed it to end. And the next morning did not bring answers. It brought another order, another move, another hour of trying to stay alive. As the months passed, Dos Palmas became a name people heard on the news. For Martin and Gracia Burnham, it was not a headline. It was mud on their clothes, weak legs, bad sleep, hunger, and the same question every morning: are they moving us again today? Some hostages were released over time, but Martin and Gracia were not. Eda Borayap, a Filipino nurse, remained with them too. The group had become smaller, and every release brought a strange kind of pain. Someone was free, which meant escape from this life was possible. But the people left behind still had to wake up in the same jungle, under the same guards, with no promise that their turn would ever come. Families waited for news. Officials talked about pressure, negotiations, and rescue plans. Soldiers searched through places where one mistake could put the hostages in even more danger. Martin and Gracia were not living inside those discussions. They were living with the next order, the next move, and the next hour they had to get through without making the men around them angry. Their marriage became part of how they survived. Not in a clean or dramatic way. A look could say enough. Sitting close could matter. Staying calm could help the other person hold on for one more day. They could not protect each other the way they wanted, but they could still remind each other they were not alone. Then, on June 7, 2002, the rescue attempt finally came. After more than a year in captivity, soldiers moved in. For someone hearing about it later, that can sound like the ending. For the people inside it, there was no time to understand anything clearly. Gunfire broke out, people dropped down, voices were shouting, and the hostages had no clean way to know who was close, who had been hit, or whether the next few seconds would save them or kill them. When it was over, Gracia was alive. She had been wounded, but she was rescued. Martin was gone. Etta Borayap did not survive either. That part does not need big words. Gracia had gone to Dos Palmas with her husband for an anniversary trip. She came out of the jungle 376 days later without him. The rescue ended her captivity, but nothing about it felt whole. The months in the jungle were gone. Martin was gone. Survival came with a cost no one could fix. Gracia came home alive. But the person who had entered that nightmare beside her did not come home with her.